I can't remember if I told you guys about this, but the last time I went to my dentist, right? I was driving. A smut scene happened right as I was pulling into the parking lot and turning off the car. So I had to just sit in my car and be like, thank goodness I'm early so I can just get my face straightened so I'm not walking in there with this major smirk on my face, having just listened to this hot. But it was like, I do not need to go in there with like a smile semi stuck on my face and no way to explain why I look like that.
I love those moments. I'm like, absolutely live it up to myself. That's what I say. I'm like, they can question all day long.
Welcome to Book Dragon Banter, a podcast where three aspiring authors talk all things books. We're fantasy focused, but we are not fantasy exclusive. Join Sage, Katherine, and me, Zinzi Bree, as we banter about all things bookish. We're so glad you're here.
This is what I'm missing out on by not doing audiobooks, because I usually don't listen to audiobooks. I occasionally do. So generally when I'm reading these scenes, I'm reading. So I'm not driving. I'm not out in public so often. Maybe I'm out in public reading, but it's a little different, much less likely.
We are late starting this recording, mostly because of me. I had like a full-on mini anxiety, depressive episode this morning. And even just getting to sit and talk with these ladies about some silly stuff for a little while has totally lifted my mood. So thank you. You guys are the best.
Yay.
Today we are talking about smut, spice, whatever you want to call it, in fantasy, sometimes most often in romantasy as well. I think I have somewhere the name of this episode being, what, smut in fantasy? Is it mental porn or is it power dynamics? And that's part of what we're going to get into. Yes, spoilers, maybe, for the books that we're going to talk about. We don't have specific books listed, but if it's a book that I've read that has smut and that's relevant to the conversation, it will get mentioned. So that might be spoiled for you. Check the show notes. That's where we usually list any books that we mention by name. And content warning. Yeah, I don't know how explicit or raunchy.
It's not obvious, right?
Yeah, like the title should say if this is appropriate for you or not. So you are forewarned. Foreplay. Nope, this is just my brain is just gonna bounce to just whatever inappropriate word is closest to the one that came out of my mouth. It'll be a good time.
Perfect.
Yep. Before diving in, I did want to help define how we're using some of these terms. As I mentioned, mental porn, we're using that more as a shorthand for fantasy fulfillment, escapism, and emotional rehearsal. It's not something that means cheaper or lesser. It's just a tool that stories have always used. As for power dynamics, that's a shorthand for narrative tension, control, vulnerability, choice, consent, and imbalances in power. It's not automatically toxic, but it is something to interrogate and not to assume. There's definitely some circumstances where with one cultural upbringing, you would look at a scenario and consider it toxic, and someone else might consider it appropriate based on their worldview. So we're not here to judge any of that, and we're not asking whether smut is good or bad. We're just asking what it's doing in fantasy, why it's in the fantasy books that we're reading, and what its purpose is, maybe even how to achieve some of the things that it's doing as far as exciting readership, which is one of the things it definitely seems to be doing, right? Particularly in the romantasy arena as opposed to just fantasy. Fantasy has always been about the imagined experience. Sex is also one of those things that's part of why the porn industry exists, right? Because there are people who want to imagine their sexual fantasies and see them played out visually. Now, I would put erotica as the equivalent as far as in the literary version of porn. I would not put explicit high smut scenes from a romantasy as a direct correlation with pornography. Like to me, that's erotica. There is a difference because there is plot in romantasy, or there should be. There is plot in fantasy in particular, and that should be more important than the romantic plot. And that's one of our defining differences between a romantasy and a fantasy is the amount of plot dedicated to the romantic relationship. Do you ladies agree with what I've said so far? Or do you think you have a different stance?
I don't think I share a different opinion, just maybe a different perspective, but I might have a way of describing some of it. So when I discuss erotica, I discuss it as written solely for the purpose of inciting emotional and physical sensations in the reader of that book, especially when it comes to the explicit content. Whereas when I think of smut in a book, I do think of it on the spice level, and anything beyond 5, I will probably think of it more as erotica. But I require like plot and character dynamics and stuff outside of the sex for it to qualify for me as being outside of erotica.
I wanted to clarify a little bit of my personal definition around stuff. For me, romantasy is often also is heavily plot driven, but the plot is a romance plot. So if you think of like your traditional romance novel and how it has an established reader expectation around happily ever after and meet cute and everything in between, to me, the romantasy is a romance plot first set in a fantasy setting, and whether or not there is spice at all is secondary. So I think a lot of romantasy these days does have a pretty high spice content because people seem to like that, but I don't know that it's inherently required. I think you can have clean romantasy. And so it is still plot driven. I think of erotica also as a little bit more, there can still be plot, but I often think of erotica as heavy on the sex, but sometimes also more emotional, like literarily emotional. I think that there's like a wide gamut of, is it just straight up a sex scene, or is there emotional dynamics that are happening around the sex? And are you going into characters' feelings around discomfort in the situation that they're in, or I don't know. I haven't read a ton of literary erotica recently, but when I read some in the last number of years, I feel like it can just be like a pornography where it's just straight up sex, but it can also be more, because in books you do get that more of that character interiority. So I think that comes through in erotica also. But if we're talking fantasy specific. So I think like in high spice romantasy, a lot of times like it is plot driven still, but there will be scenes where this is just a scene of sex. Almost if you cut the rest of the book out and had that's like a little mini porno right there. So I think it varies in that regard. My personal preference is as long as the sex is plot dependent, then I am fine with it. I don't care if it's a lot of sex on the page as long as it makes sense for the plot and for the character development, and it's not just thrown in there to like excite readers. And for me, if I'm reading a story for the story, then I want it to make sense for the point of the story. Some authors do that better than others.
And I know a few minutes ago I said I don't really read erotica, but I think after listening to your explanation, I think I do every once in a while pick up one that I would classify in that way. I think that my definition that like it's written for the purpose of the sex scenes still applies for me and like the way that I classify them. But I will read the eroticas and stuff when there is external plot and relationship development. I don't enjoy if I pick up an erotica that doesn't have that, or some of my icks are going to come up and then it's just not comfortable. And the minute I'm not comfortable, I'm not going to experience whatever the author wanted me to experience when I read it.
Unless they wanted you to feel uncomfortable, because some authors go for that in there.
Oh, yeah. I guess especially when it comes to like any kind of kink introductions and stuff like that. I think my biggest ick that we might talk about later as well, but it's non-con and dubcon. So that's non-consent and dubious consent. So I think that books that don't have that whatever the uncomfortable situation is, it makes me so uncomfortable that I will not continue. But if there is like talk and consent and all that kind of thing, and then the uncomfortable stuff happens, oh, okay, maybe. It depends a lot on the book. I'm remembering like Alchemized right now. There was a lot that made me really uncomfortable, but it still felt worth it for like getting to the plot stuff later on. And then I could, find more comfort. But I wasn't like sexually tantalized by a lot that was going on. I was just uncomfortable.
I think that one's meant for you to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Mm-mm. It was not romanticizing the circumstance.
Okay, good. Then I experienced what I was supposed to experience. I think there are a
Yeah.
lot of books right now. There are some pretty big ones out, like something about like Kill Switch, or no, that's not it. Like something about the light switch.
Do you mean Lights
where, like,
Out?
there's a stalker. Lights Out. I've heard about them.
The one, not fantasy, but that one
Sure.
is, a stalker and social media with a mask, and it's supposed to be pretty funny from what I hear. It's one of the ones where I gave He Sees You When You're Sleeping a try over Christmas, and that was my first foray into a stalker romance. However, I have a different book that is fantasy that I think the title is like Feathers So Vicious or something. It's currently sitting in my holds from the library. It is fantasy, and what I remember hearing about it is the main character is there's a sex scene where she basically gets ripped in half during the course of intercourse, and he heals her magically, and they keep going. And I was like, I want to read this book just to like understand how that's like, how did you make that sense? How did you make readers still like, like it with that kind of scenario that happens? I'll let you know. I was hoping to read that book before we recorded this, but I didn't get to it. My dance card was full.
Okay, so people with my EDS condition, that's Ehlers-Danlos for people who don't know. People with my condition often have bedroom stories to share or questions to ask and things like that, because like ripping, tearing, prolapsing, dislocations, all that kind of thing are like super common, even in the most like vanilla of interplay. And it can make the people in the context feel really uncomfortable. And there's a lot of things that go alongside that. So I wonder if with this book, some of that isn't tied into some of the like pains and things that might happen in a situation between somebody who has a disability like that, and like it gets in the way. So if I were to dislocate and it's like really bad and I like tore a hamstring while we're at it or whatever, then to have the guy like heal me up and then we can still go back to it instead of everything stops and now it all becomes like the sad day kind of moment, like maybe that would make that scene make sense. You'll have to let us know.
Is that part of like because you've made a couple comments before about Fourth Wing and you being like, there's just some things as far as practicability, right, with Fourth Wing. So is that the sex scenes one of those things where it's like, if Violet is experiencing these breaking her body moments in fight scenes, how is that not also being shown in the sex scenes? Is that?
Yes. Absolutely, that did bother me. And I was like, okay, and they're slamming each other all around the room, but we also know that she can stand up too fast and pass out. Anybody with our condition. And so I have opinions about the Fourth Wing representation. But yeah, that did bother me when it came to the intercourse, because I was like, this sex ain't reasonable with her body.
It's one thing to go visit the healer, like after you just went and did a whole fight thing and everybody's beaten up and did fighting. But if you have to go see the healer after having had sex because you threw your arm out or something during.
Yeah.
That's bad.
Well, and to be fair, Violet might not have it to the degree that some of the people in my community do. It may not affect her as much in all the same ways. EDS is one of those conditions where it is a very much a spectrum.
I was thinking that with Fourth Wing also, because it's like we could do an entire episode on this topic, but it serves the book when it makes sense to serve the book for dramatic purposes, to have her feel like injured or power through it at that moment. And then it's quickly forgotten at other times, is how I felt about her disability through the story. This part is very much, he doesn't think, like, he knows that she's got this stuff going on. He doesn't think to be gentle with her, or they're just so caught up. I think that's what happens a lot of times in these scenes, is that they're so caught up, they're so passionate with each other that, they're against the wall and throwing things around.
Lighting the curtains on fire with lightning.
Yeah, and okay, so because the passion is so intense, which plays in a little bit to the idea of the escapism or the seeing our fantasies come to life, right? Like sex, that amazing is demonstrated through these magical elements that happen.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if she's ripped in half because it's so amazing, it was an accident, still is a little suspect to me. I hate to say it. It reminds me of Twilight, though. There was like in Twilight when they didn't have sex and he's a vampire and she's still human, like they have sex and she's all beaten up afterwards because he's, as a vampire, is so much stronger than her. And like then he can't and like refuses to have sex with her again.
I mean, if you're concerned about hurting your partner because you're in a moment of passion and about to lose control of your strength, like that's perfectly reasonable, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Well,
And then to not want to do it again is a reasonable thing as a caring partner. I would think. I am now very curious to hear how this healing mid-sex scene works out. Like, do either of the people have remorse afterwards and are like, no, we're not going to go at it again, or we have to do something different because that wasn't okay? Or are they just, it's cool because we have healing powers, so we can just be as rough as we want?
There is something to be said, though. Like, I do remember reading in the Dragon Shifter series, I think I mentioned in a previous episode, the stories where like the human girls' parts aren't big enough to take the size of their partner's equipment. That book in particular, I'm going to use magic to make room in your body for the...
I'm going to use the magic to shrink the junk.
Right? Why isn't it that? Why isn't using the magic to shrink the junk on your own body? Granted, that was also the book that had my first introduction to nodding as part of like the sex scene, which is a fantasy element, right? Or in Ruby Dixon's Barbarian series, they have like a little horn on top of their penis for like clitoral stimulation, basically, is what that's for. But most of the time when the women first see the guys naked, they're like, what is that? That looks like it's hard. That looks like it's going to hurt. Whatever. Anyway, I do like those books, I will say. I think Ruby Dixon did an excellent job with the agency that the women have in those books. I binged through like the first 5 books because they're that like potato chip yummy. Anyway, they're blue. They also have horns. And I'm trying to remember if the horns for some of the guys are like having those touched or held onto are pleasurable, or for if the women, if it's just that's a convenient, here, I'm going to hold on to this while you're banging me.
Nice hand.
As opposed to,
Also, in like fantasy world, or are you in the wild? What, you don't have a bedpost or whatever to grab onto?
For example, if you're reading Sarah J. Maas and it's the Akatar series, right? Rhysand is basically, he's a human-looking guy with powers, a really attractive human-looking guy. He's got tattoos. From what I remember, he doesn't have horns. He doesn't have an extra body parts stuff going on.
He has wings.
And wings.
Love the wings.
But he can magically disappear them.
So they don't count.
I think they're his natural state. He has wings, but he can magically disappear them so
make
that
him go away.
Yeah, and I think they are very sexually sensitive. He often doesn't like to have them, like it's a weakness in a way. The wings are like, they're a strength because you can fly, but they're a weakness in the sense that they're highly sensitive.
They'd also
whatever,
be really
like, that's a big
vulnerable,
deal.
right? Like when you're on the ground and you're not up flying, like if someone puts a tear in one of those, you're grounded.
Exactly. So he keeps them, he's one of the ones who has enough magical powers to keep them like, just, into the portal world where you keep all your extra stuff. There's only Rhysand can disappear theirs.
Versus Greenbrier, the Cruel Prince, Carden Greenbrier. He's Fae and he's got a tail all the time. Like the tail doesn't go away. And I do remember seeing comments about people being like, I couldn't get over that he had a tail. Like that shouldn't be part of, do you not actually understand real like folklore around the Fae? Him still being super beautiful and just having a tail is kind of the minimum versus the level of grotesque he could have otherwise been.
He was one of the princes, and one of the brothers had like horns, like hooves, so there were different animalistic body parts. And yeah, he had a tail, but it hidden. Maybe not.
Oak, the half-brother, right, has cloven hooves. And there's the series about him. I find it interesting in fantasy and romantasy, all of that. At what point do you draw the line and say, this is now a monster romance? Because technically, a vampire Twilight should be, he's a vampire. A vampire is a classic monster. Or does monster automatically mean that it has to be like, it's a snake person, it's a lion person, or that those animalistic body parts are used during intercourse, and that's what makes it a monster romance? Like, what takes it from, oh, this is regular fantasy, over into now it's this other thing that then can be lumped in with more of the kink versions of spice?
I feel like I don't know if I've ever read any categorized as monster romance. I don't know if I've ever read any of that. But I feel like there's this line where they are still really attractive in a human way, but have these components, whether it's a tail or wings or horns or whatever, that make, you're totally right about the vampire thing. But vampires still generally in a like romance version of a vampire are very physically attractive, look like really beautiful humans, right? And it's only when they're going to feed a lot of times that like their teeth grow and they get like a creepy look, as opposed to ritual vampires or vampires in other series where they are less human, and are more looking like corpses, basically. Yeah, good question.
I haven't read into the Omegaverse or more of those ones, but from my understanding is you're either having sex when you're both in your human form, or you're having sex both as wolves, but generally I don't think that there's the in-between state, right, where you're getting the wolf's equipment in the female. Like, that's, I feel like that one would be the outlier version of those stories.
And I wonder if that's because it encroaches on people's comfort around, like, when is it considered, like, monster romance or
Bestiality.
human with special abilities romance versus bestiality. I have read some of the Omega verse stuff where I DNF'd some things because of that. But like the ears come up, the tails come up, like there's that moment where like they're trying to hold on to control and like the fur ripples and things like that and whatnot. But as far as anything that I remember, anything my brain has retained, they have either been in full human form or full animal form. And then the animal form, I don't think I've read anything where they like on the page go into that. They just might refer to it. That one is an off-screen kind of a interaction. Yeah. And to be fair, I think that if that were like dramatically all on page, I might think of that as bestiality as opposed to human.
But you can also imagine that in, I'm going to say real life, but obviously this is all fantasy. It doesn't actually exist. But in a situation where you are in love with someone and you have two forms, like where does that line get drawn? But if you actually love that person and you love them in their animal form, I would think in reality, you wouldn't necessarily draw that line unless it was a question of, like I said, safety or something like that. As far as reading and accepting, it does seem like that's too close to bestiality. But then it's really an interesting, like, where you draw the line around what it is that excites you about this. Yeah, I prefer generally the vampire trait, and for me, it's because they are charming, they're aristocratic. There's like these elements of culture that I lean towards. I can see them in a dapper suit versus like with the ripping the shirt. That's fine. I'm also not a fan of the lumberjack genre of romance, of carpenter, farmer, lumberjack kind of romance. That's not, I prefer the like in the ballroom style thing. And so then I think vampire leans more in that direction. You could see a vampire showing up to a ball and fitting in, whereas I don't see a werewolf showing up and fitting in.
Yeah, the expectations around the trope certainly do follow that. Of who's into which one, the vampire or the werewolf, is like this such interesting psychology associated with all of these things. I love these conversations.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, same thing with, like, expanding beyond the vampire and werewolf to the fae creatures with the tails or the horns or the wings.
Fae really is the new vampire right now.
Yeah, because they got the, like, hot, kind of cold.
Aristocratic.
Yeah.
The things that you listed.
Yeah, very charismatic. Totally. but they don't drink your blood. Although I did read Callie Hart's Quicksilver and Brimstone. I read those 2 books, and they're both fae and vampire, and that best of both worlds, that you could say. I think it's really, I love fantasy. I love like magic and that kind of stuff. And it's interesting when it starts going into these more elements of what makes you magical is almost like a more nature connection with your physical form. I didn't even think bestiality was one of the questions we were planning on talking about today.
Yeah. Nope. Like, I knew I wanted to bring up monster romances because having read Morning Glory Milking Farm, which I've brought up before, right? That one is a monster romance. The monster is a minotaur. And in the sex scenes, it is described when he's licking her parts, right? Like, he has a cow nose. He has a wide cow tongue with that with that texture. So that one is full on. His face has inhuman parts that are then interacting with her private parts in human-ish ways, right? But that the sensations that they would bring up would be different because it is different than human. So there was,
and is it brought up? Like, does the author go into that in detail or not really?
Yeah, like the female lead, like she thinks about that being different versus past experience, and it's not shied away from. That is part of the story. He is a minotaur. He's got minotaur parts. She's having to grab onto horns. His tackle box is like one of the largest ones she works on at the farm. As far you'll see on TikTok, they'll be like when his junk is described or the hands can't fit
like
all the way around.
Like
or what size is that?
Yes.
Like that was part of that story. The way that one was written, it was still, even though there were things that are normal icks for me in the context of the book and some of the interactions, none of it was so ick that I had to DNF, right? I was able to like, okay, this bodily fluid, like that whole book is basically about bodily fluids getting collected into milk jugs, but it was handled clinically. So I was like, if that is handled clinically, I am not bothered because it's put away in a milk jug. It's blah, blah, blah.
Might have read like a little bit of a spinoff. I was like, wait, this is strange.
Versus later when they're not at the milking farm and they're actually in his home or her home and having sex, and he produces enough to fill multiple milk jugs, and her body has to either take that or they have to plan ahead with towels and blankets. That's part of, and that was part of it that I appreciated, is that they're like, okay, this is the reality of your body and what it does, and we have to be prepared on how to handle that. I appreciate that in the context of sex scenes versus the, oh, we're so passionate, we're gonna rip clothes, we're gonna bang each other, and basically you've destroyed a room in the process of who cleans that up afterwards? Does he clean the room up or does the woman clean up the room?
The servant.
Well, yeah, if it's a aristocratic vampire romance, right? Except for the stories where like nobody goes in my room because I'm such a loner and everybody's afraid of me because they think I'm a murderer, but really secretly I'm just a teddy bear on the, because so many of the books are like that, right? We're like, they're secretly a teddy bear on the inside, even though they're absolutely murderers. Are they cleaning their room? Is some poor servant going in there terrified and cleaning the room?
Depending on how much magic you have, you just do the magic cleaning.
No, prestidigitation. Yeah, I've mended everything. I want that. Like,
oh, that would be awesome.
In real life, there's, if you want a superpower, I want to be invisible, I want to fly, I want to time. There's those big things. Being invisible could get real awkward or inconvenient, especially if you have to go around naked, right? But if I had the magic powers of mending or just like instant clean.
Instant clean.
It's such a little thing, but if that might be what I would request of magic. If it's not healing, which also comes with its own problems of if anybody finds out you have the ability to heal, no one's going to hunt you down to be like, you have perfect cleaning skills that can magically clean a room. Like, your life is not in danger. But if you get healing abilities where someone finds out you could heal cancer, you can take away a brain tumor, somebody in power is going to have that illness and come after you.
Or, these people who are actively destroying rooms through their sexual acts might really want you to come and clean up, do the cleaning.
I'm reminded again through this, like, of like what I said with Violet from Fourth Wing and like the non-reality of it, and then also what Sage, what you said, sometimes like especially for people with disabilities, we like to see it represented on the page, but we also want to be able to have the fantasy where everything is functional. We could do the banging around the room and everything like that, and it all works out just fine. So like maybe that is why the scene plays out that way. But I do appreciate when there is some kind of intentional thought around, like what you said, Zinzi, with Morning Glory Milking Farm, where they prepare with like towels and blankets and things like that. I think that
It shows
people who are
care.
reading this, who want that pre and post care kind of thing. And like, side note, the aftercare scenes with when the men are the ones who do the cleanup, always preferred in my opinion.
One of the things I really like, so Ali Hazelwood, I've only read a few of her books, but I feel like she does a good job. And she did write Bride. And I haven't read the new spin-off of that or sequel. And I think there is nodding in that one, but she handles it in this way, like their bodies are not necessarily super compatible. And she writes a lot of romance that is not fantasy oriented also. And often the sex scenes are not perfect. The people they want to have sex. They're physically attracted to each other. It's consensual, but it's messy. It's whatever awkward scenario one of the characters has going on impacts, whether it's like a social anxiety thing or they're on some spectrum, or in the case of Bride, like one's a vampire and one is a werewolf, and he has like the penis that swells up and does the nodding, right? And so that their bodies are not meant to engage in this way, and she shows the challenges and the discomfort, and it's not like a discomfort in the sense that it feels like an ick. At least for me, it was more a discomfort of sometimes this is a reality, but it's still showing that sex isn't always like this perfect everybody knows to touch each other in exactly the right way. There's a learning curve, especially the first time you have sex with. And she does, I'm sure she's not the only author who does that, but she does a really good job of, it's still sexy, but it's a little bit rough at first, and it takes some time, and it feels very relatable.
As in the sex is rough, or as in the working through it can be difficult?
Working through it can be difficult, and like that there's communication needs to be involved, that communication is required to figure out what the other person likes, that you don't just know it immediately. Are you both so good, or one of you is so good at sex that it just like magically is the most amazing thing ever? And that kind of stuff, that is where if I want to read something like that, it's probably not going to be in a fantasy novel, because I like to read fantasy for the fantasy and the magic and the world building. And so I want the sex scenes to be more realistic, have communication be like an emotional attachment sex scene. And I don't want it to just be like, I could smell him across the room and our scents were like so compatible. and then I'm like, all of a sudden I'm grinding on him. And
that makes me uncomfortable in the wrong kind of way.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't need the vampire or the werewolf across the room to be thinking about my bits and how I'm smelling in the middle of it.
And especially if it's one character has that capacity and the other one does not. Talk about power dynamics. When you have the humans
so
that
frustrating.
have all of those senses, and then the person that they are fated to be mated to, or which is one of my peeves, or just is the person they're going to end up in the relationship with, right? Can smell that they're turned on, can smell that they can need a bath. I don't know, like everything.
Yeah.
And there is a thing like pheromones is real, but when it's imbalanced like that, because usually it's not that they both smell each other. It's usually that the man can smell the woman, and everybody else in the castle or wherever they are can also tell that that they've had sex, that she wants to, and it's often to me, uncomfortable power dynamic.
Okay, so there is interesting side note that I've thought about with that. When men are turned on, it is obvious, theoretically, in different versions of being turned on, right? But they'll get a hard on. They do have that visual element that if people are staring really hard, they can figure it out. But so maybe it is like
pants are tight enough.
All of them in their leather flight pants. That must be so uncomfortable. I was thinking back to my reading journey. I know that there's a lot of adult women now who are experiencing and reading fantasy and romance because they went through the gateway of reading ACOTAR first, right? Like that was the opening to, okay, I like fantasy. That was not my experience. I grew up with fantasy, but I was thinking back, like, at what ages and what books did I get exposed to some level of spice or smut or those different things in the books that I was reading growing up? And the earliest ones that I remember that made an impression on me was the Alana series by Tamara Pierce. She disguises herself as a boy to train as a knight, and she ends up falling in love with and sleeping with Jonathan, one of her friends, who also is the prince and the eventual king of Tortal, right? He finds out her secret. He keeps it secret. She's able to continue and becomes a knight and becomes one of the first lady knights. You know, she gets to no longer hide that identity. But like he carries her to bed, and I feel like I remember scenes that were conversation of after the act where they were in bed and like getting dressed, but then continuing a conversation. Or there was we're going to bed and him carrying her into the room, right? I think I read those in middle school. From there, the other ones that I remember were Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Song, Dragon Drums, Dragon Singer. I'm probably mixing up that order, but in the last one, it's almost Melody. Like her name is a little weird. That's why I keep saying it, but getting it wrong. Anyway, she has dragons that she is attuned to and can hear in her mind, and their emotions influence her emotions. And when she has a little fire lizard, golden dragon, is ready to mate, that affects her. And when that dragon goes and mates, she is on a boat with the guy that she likes, who also has a dragon that is compatible with hers. And so it is not shown on page, but implied that their dragons go and mate and they go and sleep together. And that actually springboards their relationship because they'd been dancing around liking each other, but not doing anything about it for most of that book. If I'm going to add a fantasy element to a sexual scene where I'm bonded with a dragon and that heightens the mate, and I think maybe Fourth Wing has this too, right? Where their mating then affects you and it heightens your emotions and desire. Like that to me is a reasonable, the hormones of another creature or magical thing is happening and taking over your ability to be more reasonable and considerate in a stage when you otherwise would. That's actually where I appreciate more than one sex scene in that character's story arc, right? Like you do it because the hormones are forcing you from whatever magic thing is happening. But then after that experience, if you choose to, it's your choosing. Here's the way that things have changed because it's a choice. And there's a different level of consent going on and mutual understand, right? That appeals to me to see both versions of that happen in a story. But I was trying to think after that, it would be Twilight and it happening because I didn't think that Edward and Bella had sex until they were married. She's still human, and that's because of the author's beliefs. She made them wait till marriage, where in other books where authors have different beliefs, that might have not have been the case and that might have entered the story sooner. Those are the levels of exposure to those scenes, but none of them are hard or heavy spice scenes or whatever, versus now it seems like readers are entering and their first introduction is A Court of Thorns of Roses, which was originally listed as a YA book with aggressive sex scenes, in my opinion, because Feyre, she gets bit by what's his name during the spring rite. Tamlin, Trisket, whatever, Tamlin.
Trisket.
Sorry, it's from that YouTube video that just never gets his name right the entire thing, and it's my favorite bit from that. Here, let me explain.
Now
the
I need to watch
storyline.
that. I don't know what this is.
It's amazing. That's a much more aggressive, and that dynamic right between Tamlin and Feyre is completely unhealthy and red flags all around. And I don't know if I had read that as a 17-year-old, I would have been naive and I would not have had the critical thinking skills to go. My experience at that point in my life was still so limited that I wouldn't have known how much of it was unhealthy.
Yeah. I think that's why I'm so pro consent and discussion in the books, which is why I like Allie Hazelwood and the way that she brings things in. I mean, I've heard from some of my bookish friends who read something like Deep End, who are also into
I read that
kink either in their lives or in their media consumption. And they said that, oh no, like that, all the consent bits and all the talking and all of that just took away from the story. Like they weren't reading it for that. They wanted the sex on the page stuff.
opposite reaction in my case.
Yes, exactly. I was like, this does it for me. My brain is happy knowing that this is represented well on the page, just like you're happy that the Minotaur and what's her name had towels and things, or, you know, how, I don't know. Like when they positively represent consent in books, I think that's really important, especially since younger readers are starting to read what, at least perhaps for us, would have been considered a much more adult novel than what we would have otherwise had access to when we were the same age.
We need to wrap up. We didn't do the reader's chair or the writer's chair this time because we just decided to have a genuine discussion around this topic. Join our Fable Book Club. Our current read is How to Find a Nameless Fae by AJ Lancaster. What happens when a firstborn Fae bargain goes wrong? We haven't done a cozy fantasy yet, and this one is cozy fantasy, cozy romantasy, and our MMC is 40 plus in her age, being a spinster, right? They deserve fairy tale endings too.
With the innuendo and literally.
Oh, happy
quite
ending.
the reference to a happy ending. Yeah.
The ending, yeah.
Yeah. Don't we all deserve happy endings?
But I will take my sex with a side of fantasy. Thank you. Wait, no. I don't know if I meant that the way it came out.
If you've enjoyed this, please give us a review. It helps us to get noticed on the internet, which is crowded with lots of other book podcasts you could be listening to. So we appreciate you choosing ours. Outside of this podcast, we have Book Dragon Inc. retreats and Write With Me, Zinzi Bree, that you can participate in. More information on that is in our show notes. You can find us on social media. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned for our next discussion episode. May the spice in your next read be just right.